Hi, welcome to the Elle Russ Show, where I deliver content intended to inspire, educate, and motivate. Engage with me online at elleruss.com and on social media. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, just a quick 1-minute announcement to let you know about my virtual courses and free masterclasses. I have courses and free masterclasses based on both of my books. I have the Ultimate Thyroid Course. This is your answer to solving any thyroid issue, whether it be Hashimoto's, radioactive iodine, thyroidectomy after thyroid cancer, or just general hypothyroidism. Reverse T3 issues as well. It's an incredible value at 17 modules and 29 hours of content with amazing guest expert tutorials. I also offer the Ultimate Confidence Course. That is 15 modules and 14 hours with also a few guest expert tutorials. An incredible value, and I have free masterclasses on both of those topics as well. Visit elleruss.com to learn more. Eric Perner, welcome back, I should say, although we spoke on another podcast previously. How are you?
Great, Elle. Thank you. Thanks for having me on again.
What I'd love to do today, because I think you are so good at explaining this, and I think whether you've heard Eric before and you're listening or you haven't, if you're out there, a lot of people really don't understand, and you should send this episode to anyone who is confused about this. There are so many differences between the types of meat that are available and that are out there. Some are destructive and unhealthy for the animals and the environment and our soil, and others aren't, and those are the ones we should support. And so we're going to be talking about Rep Provisions, Eric's company, his regenerative agriculture company, raising animals in a certain way. What I'd like to start off with, though, Eric, is can you explain to us? I mean, we did some old-timey things back in the day, then we got away from it, went into like mass cow manufacturing production. Tell us about how people farm like these I-5 interstate, horrible, you drive by, you're like, oh God, it smells awful. What's going on? There's just like a shitload of cows and mud at the side of the freeway. Tell us what happens in that farming environment for those animals.
Yeah, so there's definitely a big debate in the U.S. Worldwide actually, about whether we should continue to have animal agriculture. And if you're like me, I'm like, this is an absolute necessary protein for proper human health, and that we cannot stop raising animals for our own consumption. That's just part of what I believe to protect my health and my family's health. I think it's critically important. But where the distinction needs to be made of what is damaging are, we see these large factory farms, which you mentioned, these livestock concentrated animal feeding operations, which are quite damaging to the environment, quite damaging to, I believe, to the animal's health and potentially to our health. But there are other options out there. And what we promote is a grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised beef. So all that means is when I get an animal and I take it to the processor, we're getting it up out of our pastures that morning, going directly to the processor and being processed. There's no other in-between feeding operations, like there is in conventional meat. Will you go through the conventional meat process and then go into the contrast of what you guys do? Because I'd love to people know, all right, the cows are walking around, and then what happens at these cows? Yeah, so horrible lots. Yeah. Right. And conventional, what I call conventionally raised beef, which is the majority of the majority of beef in the United States is from these concentrated animal feeding operations.
Everything at your grocery store, for the most part, in the meat department, is that.
Correct. Yes. And basically, in that scenario, when a calf reaches approximately a year old, that farmer who has to make a living himself, he will take those beef to auction, where they're auctioned off, to the lowest bidder, which are typically these large feeding operations, and then they're trucked to these large concentrated animal feeding operations where they're fed a diet of almost straight grain, maybe even corn, for about 90 to 120 days. Now, there is no denying that this puts weight on beef very quickly. That's an absolute truth. We know this.
And humans, yep.
And humans. So like I like to tell people, hey, if we locked you in a really small confined area and fed you nothing but donuts, you'd gain weight quickly as well. And this is a similar concept with beef, only they're fed high carbohydrate diet of straight grain, of which, cattle are ruminants. They're not necessarily meant to digest that much grain, that high carb diet, but it does put weight on them very quickly. So it gets them to this finished weight, and they're trying to reach about 1,200 pounds live weight. And at that point, then they will go to the processing, shipped again to the processor, and then butchered, and then ends up on our plate. Now, that whole process is quite, in my opinion, is quite cruel to the animal, right? So, going from the farm, being trucked a long way, sitting in a feedlot and in cramped conditions and fed an unnatural diet, and then trucked again to a processing plant. Yeah, it's just a very kind of difficult, a lot of stress on that animal.
And there doesn't seem to be anywhere for them to graze either.
There's no, so
let's talk about that. Let's talk about the confinement, the difference there too with the conventional.
Correct. On confined animals, concentrated animal feeding operations, they are on nothing but a dirt floor, right? There's no grass to be had anywhere. So they can only eat out of their feed bin. So no kind of, the air is horrible conditions. The runoff from that, the methane that escapes from those operations are not in any kind of natural cycle. So my thoughts is that's very damaging to the environment as well. But what we can't compete on is that they are very efficient in putting weight on cattle. My argument is I don't think it's healthiest for the land, certainly not healthiest for us as well.
So when an animal is eating a diet that is not prescribed for its DNA, like jamming a cow with corn, right? Often they can get sick, just like humans, if we're not eating our proper diet. And then they can be administered antibiotics. And then in, recent years, past decade, we see no antibiotics on, the packages. And people used to wonder, like, well, why is that? And you're like, well, because they're feeding them. They're not native diet. They're getting sick. I mean, when animals are grazing and doing what they need to do over in Oklahoma on your farm, they have like their own natural immune system. So what happens then, right? Can we talk about that difference too, and how the conventional handles it versus how you guys do?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, in these cramped conditions, not fed a species appropriate diet, it does make them sick. Many of the animals do get sick. So what they have to do is treat with antibiotics to keep them, number one, gaining weight and keep them healthy. This is a known fact that happens a lot in feedlots. On our farm and ranches in Oklahoma, that's not necessary at all. And on top of that, neither are vaccines. There's never a time where our cattle have a needle in them. So, and this compared with, very strict culling policy, we're not, transporting animals in and out off this farm. So they're typically born here, raised here, and then taken to slaughter. So these things are unnecessary in this kind of natural environment that we create. And just, if you're a believer that you don't want antibiotics in your food, then, that's you want a more natural product, and that's what we deliver.
Before we got on this call, it was funny. I was thinking about, you guys, and I was like, well, I haven't been to the website in a minute. So I just went, but before that, I was thinking about the difference in color. And I was like, the difference in the color of the ground beef that I see at the local grocery store versus the color of the ground beef of yours when I take it out of the package. And it's just such a contrasting difference. So I was thinking about this, and then I was like, oh, I haven't seen the website in a while. And I went to your website, and sure enough, like right on your website, there was a photo of like half of what the conventional ground beef. It was like exactly what I had just been literally thinking about. It is so you can see it in the meat and you can taste it. You can absolutely, I challenge everyone, please, like, get yourself some Rep Provisions ground beef just to try and see and do it. Get some 80/20 from your regular store and compare the taste, compare the texture, compare what it looks like and the quality, and you can see it in your hands.
Yeah. Our taste buds tell us, there's a difference. And when you look at it, there's a visual difference. And I think that, directly correlates to the nutrient density in our beef, because they're fed this natural diet over a long period of time. And those nutrients accumulate in that beef, and it showcases partly in that color. I mean, it's a more vibrant, darker, richer color. And this is also, if you've ever eaten wild game, you'll notice the difference in color in wild game and how dark and rich it is. We get accustomed to seeing this light colored ground beef and think that's normal, but it's not normal. When you have an animal that's raised correctly, eating the right diet, the colors are much dramatically different.
One of the things I want to go back to another contrast here between conventional feedlots and what you're doing. What they've also failed on is their job, or I would want to say their sort of what should have been imprinted on them naturally as avoiding being land managers, right? In some way, like what is happening with the land on those conventional feedlots, that muddy ground, just let's talk about the difference between that land in and of itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening there versus how you guys do it and how you're contributing and how you take on that responsibility. It's an extra one, but it's built within it as being like a land manager.
Correct. And I like to think of regenerative agriculture as a method of agriculture that kind of restarts those natural cycles, or it maintains them if they're already in good shape. And as part of the cycles in nature, one of them is the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And on our land, when we're growing healthy grass, that grass, and we promote as best we can native perennial grasses. So these are typically much deeper rooted. And when you have these deep rooted grasses, they're contributing to a improved water cycle because they're allowing that infiltration of water deep down in the soil. In addition to that, those roots, through the plants growing and the magic of photosynthesis, they're creating carbohydrates and end up as exudates in the roots that feed that soil microbiology. So that is carbon storage in your soil. So that's healthy soil. So an improved carbon cycle and water cycle. Now, when we contrast that with the conventional, what you mentioned, cattle just standing on dirt paddocks, all of those cycles are broken. There is no water infiltrated in a dirt paddock because there is no permeability from any plant that creates it to absorb it. In addition, if there's no plants growing, there's no carbon cycling. So all those cycles of nature are completely broken on a scenario which you just painted. And I think it's critical that, we do everything to accentuate those cycles and expand them as best we can when we are growing food.
Well, and you show the stark difference between land, like kind of flat shaven land across the street from you, and the sort of high tall grasses and like lushness of also insects and the other things created by this. So let's talk about the downward spiral, the domino effect of the land, what you just mentioned. And you've explained it before, but I love it too. And people need to understand about again, just the part from like the hoofs, right, on the ground to all of the processes that happen then on a farm like yours.
Yeah. Yes. So again, one thing I want to point out, when we, the grasslands here in Oklahoma, if you were able to measure them, what you would find is about on 1 acre of land here in Oklahoma, if you were able to measure the above ground biomass is about 1,000 pounds. But what you're not seeing below the ground, the root structure and all the microbiology that's happening below, is about 3,500 pounds of mass. So, 3.5 times more is going on below ground, which we're not seeing. And that's probably the most critical piece. But those animals really keep that in balance. And like you mentioned, with their hoof trampling, their dung, their urine, that fertilizing, they're punching seeds into that soil so they can create more plants and more growth. And what happens is life begets more life, and on. The more life you have above ground, the more life you have below ground. And as you mentioned, the insect activity and all these other things are carbon-based organisms, all part of wrapping up carbon in that natural cycle. And when we plow land, for example, a lot of the large monocrops is corn and soybean. All that is broken. So, when we talk about trying to, when we're concerned about animals' health and well-being, and we think about, animal deaths, sometimes that's critical to folks. I would argue in conventional operations and monocrop operations, there's far more animal deaths than there are in scenarios like we're doing, because we're creating so much additional life because of our processes.
Well, and look, there are so many large animals that get killed in the protection of soy fields. So if you're
that's what I mean. Yeah.
If you think that eating soy, you're saving animals, you've actually been contributing to killing several on the back end. It's just by proxy. You just didn't really realize
by
it.
proxy, but it's devastating, Elle. Like,
yes.
Think about a 1,000-acre soy field that's plowed every year, heavily sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. All living life except that plant is wiped out. So what was home to, millions of insects and, other kind of creatures that lived in that is completely wiped out. It is a full-on desert compared for most life except that one plant.
I want to, you did a post on this, by the way. I mean, everyone should visit Rep Provisions on Instagram. You can see so many great videos of his farm, and there's so much educational material. And that's what I love about you, is that you are constantly educating everyone. Okay, back to the shitty flat dirt field of the conventional feedlot. And then when all those freaking cows dropped dead in the heat, that was like, and you focused on that. You did a video kind of explaining the difference. Like, we talk about that scenario, because I want people to hear like what happened and why, and that wouldn't have happened had they been treated another way, had they been proper land managers. Can you get into a little bit of that and explain that scenario?
Yeah. So what happened in Kansas, this was in the spring, they had a really unusual heat wave come through in a time of year when it's typically, 80 degrees. I think it was 100 plus, something of that nature. And there were estimates that as many as 10,000 head of beef perished in that brief heat wave. And what you had was a scenario where you had fat cattle. So these were cattle that were near finished. So they had lots of fat on them. All right. So that's number one. That's cute. It's like a obesity epidemic with these beef. And they had a heat wave come through that created a lot of heat on. So one thing that's important to note is when we talk about bare soil, it reflects a ton of heat. And in fact, I've measured this and I've shown it before in some of my educational piece. I will measure on a warm summer day the temperature of bare soil, and it will be close to 130 degrees. And then I'll measure it on my soil that's covered in grass, and it'll be 80 to 90 degrees. So it's emanating a lot of heat, right? And so when they had this heat wave, and fat cattle, it cooked them on the inside. I mean, they were not, number one, it was an abrupt heat wave, so they weren't adapted to it at all, and a lot of them died. And I think the fact is that while that one got publicized a lot, it's an ongoing struggle for these large concentrated animal feeding operations, that deaths are pretty common because of heat, but just because we've broken these cycles in nature and created extremely fat beef, unhealthy, I would say, and it sometimes makes it hard to keep them cool their bodies efficiently enough.
Okay, this might be a messed up question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because there might be one person out there who's thinking of it. In that scenario where the 10,000 cattle got like just cooked, but they were near finished, can you quickly save something like that as a rancher? Can you be like, shit, we got to chop up 10,000? I mean, or is it like, you can't? Are there rules about that? Were they able to save any of that? Is that meat able to be like, well, they're all dead right now, I guess we just now need to skin them? I mean, I know that sounds, but that's sort of a logistical thing that popped up. Like, it's a
so they wouldn't be fit for human consumption, because in USDA plants, the cattle have to be taken live to the USDA plant.
Got it. That's what I thought.
And then the USDA inspector inspects them live, make sure they're healthy, and then they're cut up after that and then inspected again. So that they wouldn't be for human consumption. I suppose there may have been some dog food company that might have grabbed them, but
Gotten a deal.
cattle, they swell pretty quickly and they start decomposing very quickly in that
Oh,
kind of heat. So not
okay.
sure if they ended up, and certainly didn't end up on anyone's dinner plate, but maybe
Just a
in your
bunch of
dog food.
wasted, just a bunch of wasted,
Yeah.
just a bunch of
Yeah.
wasted
Basically, I think
wasted
it's
life. Yeah.
probably right. Yeah.
That's a
Unfortunately.
bummer. But it's so
Unfortunately.
important to see these different contrasts and how these seemingly small things like hoof trampling and embedding a seed into the ground because of the hoof, and then like you said, the water retention. So if you want to contribute to the flourishing of our land and thus ecosystems, please buy regenerative raised meat. This is the way to contribute to it. What are some other objections or some things that you hear often that you're like, oh boy, here we go, another, like,
Yeah.
if I hear someone be like, saturated fat will give you a heart attack, I'm like, okay, that's just such a blanket wrong statement, right? So what are
Yeah.
some things you hear around this topic that you can clear up maybe for people that have possibly heard the same things?
Yeah. So since you talked about saturated fat, that's a good one because we've been told, at least since the 80s when the USDA came out with their food pyramid, which basically recommends a high carb, low fat diet. Animal fats are bad, saturated fat are bad. Cholesterol is bad. It will give you a heart attack. All these things that we've been preached to for decades now. I think people are kind of still cling to that and think about fat. How's fat bad for us? And I would just argue that when you look at fat from our animals, from our grass-fed, grass-finished animals that, like, as we've talked about, that are fed this species-appropriate diet of grass, it's what they're meant to eat, that's what they're meant to digest. When you look at that fat compared to conventional beef, there's a difference. And we've measured that difference, and it's significant. It's not, when you eat a lot of beef, it's significant. And basically, our beef is much higher in omega-3s than conventional beef. And I think that maybe the saturated fat issue, we could dive into those details, but there's been a lot of talk about fat being bad for us. I just believe that is not the case. It's the combination of all the other ingredients, and then also how we raise animals that create this bad fat. But when you look at grass-fed beef, which carries an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio R's of 1:1 versus conventional beef, which is often 10:1 or greater, there's a difference there. There's a difference in those healthy fats in grass-fed animals versus conventional beef.
Yeah. And so for people out there, I do want to highlight one thing about the government food pyramid that they installed, which was, it says to eat, it's almost laughable. It's crime. It's 6 to 11 servings of grains per day, plus 2 to 4 servings of fruit. Canola oil, just absolutely fine in there, and all sorts of other things. So also saturated fat. It is not bad. It will not clog your arteries or heart. However, if you are eating a high saturated fat diet plus a high carb diet, good luck. That's where you're going to run into problems. And that's where they weren't factoring things in back then. The study on that was so cherry picked. And CJ Hunt does a really good job in The Perfect Human Diet of going through this. But at the end of the day, so it's really the combination, because if you're eating such high sugar, carbs, bread, it's still sugar, it's carbs, it's all the same thing. Then your body is dealing with that onslaught that it wasn't meant to. And then, yeah, you know what? You might be storing some fat and it might be not getting burned and doing the thing that's right for you. But that's why carnivores, when you look at their lipid panel and they're eating high amounts of animal fat and animal meat, again, their cholesterol levels are not worrisome because of their particular diet. And it's not dangerous. So it can be, but again, so I think back in the day, and like, we've got to get our husbands to stop eating steaks, like back in, when the 80s and stuff. And it's like, yeah, but what the fuck else were they eating? And if you look at that, That's the problem. So it's not a problem, but there's so many nuances to it. But in and of itself, it's not bad. In fact, it's necessary. We need cholesterol for all of our hormones and cells. That's why a lot of vegans and vegetarians either have delayed menstruation as females and or go through early menopause at like age 40. And we need it hormonally. So you have to have fat in your diet. You cannot live without it. You could technically live without a carbohydrate in your life because at some point your body will turn meat into that. So, it's such we have to continue on pushing the message of contributing to ranches like yours and getting our meat that way. And also it's best to focus health-wise on the wild meat, AKA wild meaning doing what they should be doing in the wild, but you're just corralling them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We're mimicking nature. And Elle, it's fun. So the way I've had explained to me, what you mentioned of this combination of factors between, high cholesterol foods and then all these high carb, sugar, like the way I had it explained to me that made sense is like, if you're consuming a high omega-6 diet, which we talked about which is in grains and canola oil and seed oils and all these, processed oils that oxidize easily, you're creating a lot of inflammation in your body. And if that inflammation is transferring to your artery walls in your heart, the cholesterol is the repair mechanism trying to fix that, right?
Yes, you're right.
That's where the accumulation comes, right?
It is an inflammation of the arterial, like exactly.
And that's what cholesterol is trying to fix it. Unfortunately, it will, yes, but it's really the combination of these things that's not good for us.
Right. So if you're eating a standard ancestral paleo, primal, or carnivore-ish type of diet, but it's even a standard paleo, even if you're doing 80-20 and that's the best you can do, you're still going to be better than most. But the places where I try to do my best are the types of meat, the quality of meat, and of course, quality fats, like staying away from the canolas and the other garbage that's out there and sticking with the good ones. All right. So first of all, everyone, you can use the code L15 at Rep Provisions to get 15% off if you want to try any of Rep Foods. I want to just talk about a couple things that I've made from your wonderful animal. I have cooked up some major tomahawk ribeye steaks from you guys. Those tomahawk ribeyes. Those were so amazing. Fed so many people. People were just blown away. And of course, I didn't tell them until later that I was like, by the way, that's what a grass fed. They were just like, this is unbelievable. The ground beef I've tried with my parents who swear by this other ground beef at one store that they go to. And I said, I just didn't even tell them. I was like, hey, this is just really like the best ground beef. And they were blown away by it. And we made burgers for the whole time I visited. I love all of your products. You've also expanded and you've got give us a everyone go to repprovisions.com, but give us a little selection of what you have going on because you've even expanded. I saw you had some oxtails recently and I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah, well, that, with our beef, we are also offering, along with this kind of elimination of seed oils in our diet, we're offering some really healthy ingredient sauces, a line of sauces that we're now selling that you can pair with our meats if that's something you like. In addition, we have created different with some great meatballs and some specialty items. We'll have some hot dogs coming out soon as well. We are growing now, first time ever, corn and soy-free pork. So those will be available in March. And so the reason that's important is the corn and soy in the diet of pork and chicken is what drives up that omega-6, omega-3 ratio. So we're trying to create the lowest polyunsaturated fatty acid pork on the market. And
love it.
That's going to help by getting them a better diet. Because one thing we have to explain here, Elle, is pork and chicken, anywhere you buy anywhere, has some starches fed to it. It's just it's unavoidable. And that's been kind of the downside to it. But we believe if we can get that starch is right, that we can begin to lower that omega-6 omega-3 ratio to create an even healthier pork and a healthier chicken for folks as well.
Oh, that's incredible. I can't wait to try that.
And we're going to come out this year a line of frozen dog food as well. So we know A lot of people are very passionate. We have a lot of customers who say, hey, we can only feed our dog your meat because it's the only thing that makes them healthy. And dogs that were on death's bed have now been regenerated and doing amazing. So we're like, man, we've got to do it for the pets too.
Oh, absolutely. I know plenty of people that feed their animals meat. Yeah, straight up meat.
Yeah.
They're usually
one other thing. Yeah, I'm sorry. If you're trying to get more organ meat in your diet because of the high nutrient density of organ meats, liver and heart, I'm talking about, we create an organ blend. So it's a ground beef. It's our 80-20 ground beef mixed with 10% heart and liver, and you're getting that little extra nutrient density kick in your ground beef, and you can barely taste it.
I'm so glad you're doing that. I'm so glad you're doing that, because so many people are so adverse to eating it directly, and I get that. I happen to like it, but you can't even taste it. It's covered up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I would encourage people to try that, looking for a little extra nutrient density.
Yeah, and a great way to get organ meats into your kids, because they're not going to know the difference when you give them a burger.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So anything else that we need to talk about this in arena? I mean, it's expanding, isn't it? I mean, I'm feeling hopeful about it, or are we not feeling hopeful about it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we continue to grow. We continue to gain customer base. We continue to enroll additional ranches in our program of regenerative certification. It's still, we're a very small majority of the total meat, but it's growing quickly. We have great story to tell. We have, from solutions to the biodiversity loss to climate change, we're part of the solution. We're not part of the problem. And as people begin to learn that, they support that. And just the ease of getting meat delivered directly to your door.
So easy.
We ship 2-day shipping nationwide. So that's another new thing that we've implemented as well.
I love it. Well, everyone, please try something from Rep, because their meat is outstanding and great selection of products. And like you said, continually developing sauces and healthy condiments are always appreciated and always needed in this environment too. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and for educating us, and also just for being a part of helping our land and environment. I mean, you are really literally the grassroots. I mean, legit, literally the grassroots of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting a real movement, and we're not stopping. We're all very passionate about creating a better environment and a healthier environment and giving back, so these are things that are critically important to us. As long as we get the support of the consumer, there's no stopping us.
I love it. Thank you so much. And for everyone else, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Elle.
Hey listeners, over the years, a ton of companies have approached me to collaborate, but I will only promote companies whose products I believe in and that I actually use and consume on a regular basis. So let me tell you about some of my favorite companies that I can offer you discounts for. Rep Provisions, an amazing company doing incredible things for our planet, topsoil, and animals with regenerative agriculture, and it's my #1 source for quality pasture-raised meat and chicken. Visit repprovisions.com and use code L15 for 15% off. I'm also obsessed with a company called Carnivore Crisps. They make a lean, all-natural, and delicious alternative to conventional snacking, made with just real meat and real salt. Totally addictive, and my favorite ones are the beef brisket and the ribeye. Visit carnivorecrisps.com and use code PALEO10 for 10% off. I also love and regularly use Paleo Valley products. They make amazing supplements and delicious paleo products. I use the superfood greens powder, grass-fed beef sticks, the organ complex, and their bone broth bars. I love the lemon and apple. I also use their essential C complex and more. Visit paleovalley.com/promos/Elle Russ for 15% off. I also love Primal Kitchen. They make delicious paleo-approved, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and no refined sugar products, and I use them daily, from their collagen powders and sauces and marinades to their avocado and olive oil. So good, so healthy. Visit primalkitchen.com and use code L10 for 10% off. I also love paleo powder and use it almost on everything I cook. They make incredible seasoning blends, and they also have these incredible grain-free coatings that feel just like crispy breadings that you would have had prior to knowing that there's another way. So visit paleopowder.com and use code L15 for 15% off.